So when we work on a project, there are various people involved, and each of those people has access to Git and to the source control repository. And we are going to simulate that here. So for example, we have an architect, and we'll call the architect Andrea. She was responsible for creating the initial project, setting up Git flow, and doing the initial check-in. And we've seen that already in the previous chapter. We then have Dan. So Dan is our developer, and Dan will work on features and hotfixes, and we'll see the work Dan does in this chapter. There's also Rachel. So Rachel is going to review our code, pick up any errors that Dan may have introduced, and manage the review process. And we'll also see Rachel in this chapter as well. And finally, there's Bob. And Bob is going to be our build manager. So Bob will manage the build server and set up all the commands on the build server. And we'll come across Bob later in this class. So for these players, I'll create a subdirectory within my main directory, just to simulate the fact that different work is done by different people. So if I look in my demos directory, for example, then we'll have a directory for Andrea, the architect, for Dan, the developer, and for Rachel, the reviewer. If I flip into Andrea's directory and do the same thing here, we'll see that this is the person that initially set up the project. So Andrea was the person that did the Git init, did the Git flow init, to create the initial Git project. There's also code in here now. So this is Java code that's largely irrelevant for this class. So Andrea's gone away, created the initial project, created the initial build files, and copied those files into this directory. And she's also copied this code into the repository, checked the code in, and pushed the code to the central repository. We can see here that Andrea is on the develop branch. There's also a master branch for this repository. If I flip over to a browser, we can see the Git flow repository inside GitHub. This is called PS Git flow. And again, here we can see the checked in code. And here we can see there's a master branch and there's also a develop branch. And at the moment, these two branches are the same. We've created the master and develop branch, checked the code into master, merged that code across to develop. So these two branches are exactly the same. So what we'd like to do now is to create our first feature. So the person that will be creating this feature is Dan. So if I flip to the next tab here, I'm in a directory called demos Dan. So again, just to simulate the fact that this is a separate user. And at the moment, Dan's folder is empty. So if I do a directory in here, then there's nothing in this folder. So the first thing we need to do is to get Dan to clone the repository. So this is the URL of the repository. So for Dan, I can do a git clone, passing in the URL of the repository, but I don't want to create a subdirectory here. So I'm going to tell git clone to clone into this directory. Otherwise, this would create me a PS git flow subdirectory. Notice that we're on the master branch, and I can change the develop branch by doing a git checkout develop. So Dan currently could work on the master branch or the develop branch. And we know that's not what we want. We want Dan to work on a feature branch. So the next step will be setting up that feature branch. To create the feature branch, we're going to do git flow feature start. And then we'll give the feature branch a name. But what name are we going to give this thing? At the very least, we're going to give the feature branch a name that reflects the work we're doing on the feature. But one good practice says that we should give the feature branch a name that we can use to refer back to the issues that we're creating around this feature. So for example, if we're using GitHub, we can use GitHub to create issues, and we can use those issues to track the work that we're doing. Obviously, the same is true whichever feature tracking system you're using, whether it's Jira or one of the other systems. You can create issues there. So let's follow this practice. So if I go into issues and create a new issue, we'll give the issue a title. Again, the title here and the actual feature we're developing isn't really relevant for Git flow. We just want to create an issue. So if I click on submit new issue, we end up with an issue, and issues have a number. In this case, we have issue number 2. So one thing we have to do before we can get Dan to use Git flow is to actually initialize this repository for Git flow. So remember, Dan cloned the repository. We have a local copy of the repository on Dan's machine. This local copy won't have Git flow initialized yet. So we have to remember to initialize Git flow for each developer. So back on Dan's computer, we need to do a Git flow init again. And again, we select all of the defaults. And then once we have that, we can now go ahead and create the feature branch. So back on Dan's computer, we can now do Git flow feature start and give the feature a name. So this is feature number 2, and we titled it something like users can access single entries. So at this point, Git flow will go away, create a new branch for us, a new feature branch. Notice this lives in the feature sub-branches. So we have a feature branch, and inside there we have the sub-branch of 2-. It will also check out this branch. What it hasn't done, if I go back to GitHub, is that it hasn't pushed that branch back to the repository. So there's no tracking in the central repository for this branch. And just to check, if I just refresh the page and look at the branches, we still have a develop branch and a master branch. So we've had Dan go ahead and make some changes to the code. We can see that the prompt is now highlighted in red. This means that there's some untracked changes within Git. And indeed, if I do a Git status here, we can see that we've changed a couple of files. Now at this point, we can do our normal Git process. So I can do a Git add to add those files into Git, and then do a Git commit and leave a message. So we can say added code to get single entry. And we're good at this point. At this point, the feature branch has the changes made to it, and those changes have been checked in to the local branch. What we'd now like to do is to make those changes available to for other people to look at and maybe to review and also to comment on.